Hi, I'm John Beecham and welcome to Holistic Podcasts.
With me on the line, I'm very pleased to have Professor Joanna Trzeciak Huss from Kent State University.
Hi.
It's great to talk with you today. It's taken a while to organize this conversation, so I'm super happy that we've managed to get in touch and to kick off this conversation. You are a translator, yes? Can you say a few words about yourself, please?
Sure. I'm a literary translator. I've been a literary translator for a long time. I translate Polish, largely Polish poetry, although I translated some prose. I usually study with one given poet. So I started with Wisława Szymborska, the Polish poet who won a Nobel Prize in 1996. I've known her for a very long time. I also translated Tadeusz Różewicz, another Polish poet, roughly of her generation. And I also translated him for a long time. And I keep returning to these two poets. Currently, I'm translating Polish poet Zuzanna Ginczanka, who's actually a stateless poet, but wrote in Polish. That's also a project that is coming to fruition. I've been translating her for about 9 years, and a book of translation is coming out from Zephyr Press.
Fantastic.
And I also translated for a really dear friend of mine, Ewa Zadrzyńska, for Poetry Unites project, and I translated about 40 different Polish poets. I also translate from Russian and currently Ukrainian.
Okay, of course, Ukrainian being a more popular language now than it ever has been, right? Because of obvious reasons.
Yes, it was actually a Polish poet, Zuzanna Ginczanka, that led me to translation of Ukrainian poetry because she herself was a translator from Ukrainian in the 1940s. So I elected to spend 2 summers in Lviv in 2017 and 18. And that's where I started learning Ukrainian and translating from Ukrainian.
That's fantastic. And of course, Ginczanka is also becoming a fairly popular poet at the moment. I know of a few friends who are very much engaged with the work of Zuzanna Ginczanka. So it's great to hear that she's gaining traction. But of course, since you've been dealing with her poetry for 9 years, I think you got a slight head start on everyone. But let's get on to the main topic of this conversation. And I wanted to ask you about certain aspects of translation and how you approach translation. I wonder how many listeners we have to the Holistic Podcast who dabble in translation themselves. So to begin with, and this is not just to do with Polish language translation, but in general, what is your translation process, right? How do you approach a text? And if you could tell us how do you approach a text and what are the things you look out for at the beginning?
So it's, I'm mostly a poetry translator. So I'll focus on translating of poetry, which is, I think, an extremely concentrated form of language. So I'm beginning to be obsessed with trying to think through the process of translation. And I'm searching actually for a visual language to representing it. I am having some luck with publishing translations with cross-out choices, with different sort of putting different versions. So inviting the reader into the process of translation. But ultimately, the process of translation is an embodied process, and it cannot be disconnected from a given time and place. So I am also trying to represent that. And, it is process that takes, of course, some distinct stages. So I can talk a little bit about those stages, but it cannot be always separated because a lot of the reading happens in the revision process. So, of course, the process of translation involves reading and analysis of a work. That's probably the first step. And thinking through the formal elements, the cultural elements that, all the devices that are at work, and and also a relationship between other works. And in the cases of several of the poets that I worked with, those relationships were hidden. They kind of emerged not in the first, not at first reading, not at second reading, not even in the process of initial translation, but in the process of revision, when I kind of noted something jumped out, and it all of a sudden it turned out that it is a line from another poet, from another poem. And usually because it was not visible, because it was a translation of a translation, So when I approach a poet, I usually approach several, it's the whole, in case of Ginczanka, in case of Różewicz and Szczyborska, is almost the whole body of their poetry. So in case of a given poem at work that I undertake, I usually make the provisional translation. So it kind of involves a certain sort of recognition and notations of certain elements that I like: versification, capitalization, punctuation, and of course a word choice. So I used to do it electronically, and I used to kind of leave almost no traces of the translation process. So it was only the product that the readers encountered. But now I've started to mark these elements on the page of the original work. I started to work with usually it's the book. And those books right now are just so marked. I note everything. I note, so kind of almost like a palimpsest. So I note the time of day, how many times I revisit a given translation, what's going on in the world, how does that influence where I am mentally, So it's a kind of almost like a thick translation that finds a graphic representation in terms of the page of the original. And of course, out of that emerges a provisional translation that is electronic, that then I revise. And when I have a version, I want to test it on an audience. So I kind of usually send it around to a group of friends. It's a very critical group. And some of them are bilingual and very skilled at catching flat-footedness and felicities that, again, are kind of marked on the page of the original work. And I return also because I do some of the markings on the page of the original, I return and reread the original, and I look for the possibilities that are lurking in the English language, as well as the things that sort of that I discover in the process of revisiting. Usually it's the Polish or the Russian or the Ukrainian. So, I really like the generative sort of process of approaching a given work and asking yourself, like, how would a given poet express this phrase had they known the English language? Because most of my translations are into English.
Sure. Well, that's the kind of the ethics of it, right? You're a Polish native speaker, not an English native speaker, or were you?
I'm bilingual. I mean, I'm truly bilingual. I mean, I think I keep up with my Polish because I read a lot, and I also try to keep my pulse on the life of Polish culture, but it's it's interrupted. There are times where I don't visit Poland. I mean, but I do usually come at about 3 times a year. So, so it gives me a good sense of what's going on. I also read the paper every day and read academic journals. So it's helpful. But I speak English every day. It's a language that we speak at home.
Sure.
And I'm an academic, so that's also the language of my work. So
absolutely. I wanted to ask, I mean, you've been talking about, let's say, trying to almost be an someone else's shoes and while reading their text. This is this idea of point of view, right? And I remember when I was studying translation, I was an exchange student at the English department at the Jagiellonian University, and I spent a year attending lectures on cognitive grammar and learning all about Gadamer's view on hermeneutics and all the rest of it. And I think my one takeaway from that year when I was there was really being able or trying to, as translators, to get into the mind of the author and see whether not just the words but the actual otoczka, so the surroundings and the language, the register, whether all of these minute details sometimes can actually be translated as well, especially that when you're looking at a language such as Polish and English, which are extremely culturally bound. They are in essence extremely different languages because the experiences and the cultures of the two countries or of the two languages are extremely different. I mean, how do you go about that as a bilingual person and someone who knows obviously Polish extremely well, English extremely well? Which barriers for you are the hardest to overcome? And I'm sorry, that was an extremely long-winded question, so I'm sorry about that.
Well, first of all, I don't really try to get into a mindset of a poet. I think that it's not a possible task, but I think I try to think about the strategy of a given work, of a given poem, short story, novel, because I also translated a novel.
Mm-hmm.
That's usually more possible. And it comes with, as I said, kind of careful reading that takes into account cultural context. So with the case of the current poet, Zuzana Ginczanka, it actually helps me that I know Russian very well. I mean, I'm also fluent in Russian. And it helps me because she came from a Russian-speaking Jewish family. And a lot of words have their roots in, and a lot of her neologisms have their roots in Ruthenian, Ukrainian, Russian words. However, oftentimes she also avails herself of poetry from 18th century Poland. There's few discoveries that I made of kind of much earlier poems and poets that are kind of, so it's basically, these are, I think, archaisms. So she's using kind of archaic words that she encountered in the earlier Polish verse that are kind of masquerading as neologisms. So reading wildly kind of helps. And of course, I avail myself of translation technology, of the internet, so it's much easier sometimes to detect certain things. And I also have a number of dictionaries that kind of date back to 16th and 17th century. So that is also helpful. Ultimately, it is very difficult to be translating rhyming verse. And so the difference between English and Polish is also a difference between the English and Polish poetics. And when you translate a poet from the interwar period where rhymed poetry was, and especially was essential to poems that were published as satirical poems, where kind of a lot of it rides on the poem being funny.
It's like a limerick quality, right, to it?
Not just limerick, it's satire was a weapon.
Yeah.
And in order for the weapon to work, it has to be sharp. It has to be clever. It has to be
Witty.
Absolutely. So how do you do that in English without losing the weight, without losing the kind of sting? So you don't fall into the, basically a nursery rhyme. So it kind of gets the kind of not just the cleverness in, but also the precision of sometimes humor that is very culturally specific because it's intended to mock particular individuals or at a particular time. So hence here, I avail myself of notes. And also, many times these individuals are sort of satirized using kind of invented mock names. So I've had a lot of fun sort of trying to do that in English, trying to find kind of equivalent jabs, and
Yeah.
yeah. So, but for my work, and as translator, paratext is really important. So I'm trying to always negotiate for a space to write notes, but also introduce a given work, introduce a given poet, provide the contextual, and also contain as much of the context in the text. So that makes for a very difficult task.
Difficult task indeed. And what do publishers say to that when you say, I need a little bit of extra space here to give some notes to the readers? I mean, how do they respond to that?
It was a kind of a no-go at first. For many years, I've tried to do that. And currently, it is a very different climate. It's a climate that sort of is much more friendly to translators. And also, I found a group of people, publishers, who are more open to experimentation, graphic and experimentation, and we have the means to do that. So essentially, my first sort of foray into kind of showing the translation process was with Hopkins Review, where they gave me the space to introduce the poetry of Zuzana Ginczanka, talk about translation process, show the whole sort of actually
kind of thought process, right?
Yes, and also the kind of graphically represented, and of course, you can't you can't fully get everything on the page because a lot of the things kind of have to be considered more in kind of an essay form rather than brief notations. But I was able to do that, and now currently I'm working with letterpresses and trying to kind of publish little books that kind of mark the process of translation. So that's really fun. And and I'm moving kind of away from the notion of the achievement of a individual translator to acknowledging translation as a collaborative effort. I, after all, rely on dictionaries that were compiled through enormous effort of many individuals over many years, and in my case, several centuries. I am sending my translations to friends and colleagues who offer input that change the way the poem sounds, the way it works, the way I think about it. And that has to be acknowledged. And also all the institutions that are involved in putting a work out into the audience. And again, audiences are without the audience, there will be no poetry. So kind of thinking through the audience. And that's a kind of a much richer notion of collaborative process that involves, people, institutions, technology. And that's what makes it so much different than the instantaneous translation that comes from
a machine, right? For instance, yeah.
Lucky for me, the machines are still not good with translation of poetry or translating rhymed verse. So machines, I mean, and I'm not saying that it's not that this is not upon us, but I'm still kind of lucky that I'm translating in a time where that is still not worked out fully.
Well, I think in general, when we think about translation, I obviously on a day-to-day basis, I use both English and Polish. Yes, sometimes I translate texts, and yes, sometimes I use online tools to help me with my translations. But of course, then you really have to go in and edit and double check and triple check and quadruple check that everything's been translated properly. But what you said about collaborative translation is very interesting indeed. I know three translators, four now because I've now met you online, albeit, but three translators whom I know pretty well. They translate from Polish into English as well, and yeah, they're very open to kind of collaboration, to let's say peer checking as well. I find, especially with let's say Polish translators, because there are a number of us around across the world, right? But it's not the most popular language to translate from. So I have noticed a kind of how these translators, especially from Polish into English, there is a lot of toing backwards and forwards. What does this word mean? Which context can you use it in? And all the rest of it. And I'll even go one step further. Olga Tokarczuk, as I'm sure you know, also has an annual meeting of her translators from across the world, and they discuss how they go about translating her work, right? And of course, her corpus has just become obviously that much more popular because of the fact that she has a Nobel Prize. But thinking again about Olga Tokarczuk and some of the things which she writes about, they are universal, but at the same time they are so entrenched in Polish culture and the Polish mindset. And going on from that, I'd like to ask you, are there simply things which are untranslatable for you? Do you think that let's start off with Polish, right? Can you think of anything in Polish which is just simply impossible to translate into English? And I'll also give a think while you're thinking. And do you think that, untranslatability can be overcome? And I'm not talking about just paraphrase here, but is there anything that can be done about untranslatability?
Well, first of all, I wanted to return to Olga Tokarczuk and to sort of pull a plug for a book that I am editing with Kasia Szymańska. Kasia Szymańska invited me to this project, and it was her project initially, and I came in to help with editing the parts of this is a project called Tender Translator, and it's scholars writing on the translations of Olga Tokarczuk, and also translators writing on the process of translation of Olga Tokarczuk.
Okay, there we go.
Yes, so it is going to be an entire book because it involves translators from around the globe. I mean, we were limited by obviously who came to answer the call, but we were trying to address as many languages and cultures as possible. So that's, it's a wonderful way to showcase the translation process, focusing on a given author and ways to render that author in different languages and cultures, because it's always a kind of a process of that involves both languages and cultures,
Sure.
and a given time and space, of course. But when it comes to untranslatability, to answer that question, I don't think it's a helpful concept in general, and it's a concept that is really should have died long ago and has not yet. Because obviously we do translate the untranslatable. So I really think of it slightly differently in terms of it maybe things being incommensurate. I kind of borrow from philosophy of science and kind of look at the sort of webs of meaning, not words, but worlds. So how do you kind of render something in another kind of web of meaning, cultural web, for a different audience? So, and that becomes a lot more doable and a lot more sort of practical, and you compensate. Of course, maybe one word might not be precisely captured in another language and culture, but in a given context, because language is contextual and it's conventional, and these conventions change. And maybe at one point, something that is not translatable, quote unquote, and again, I just, it turns out to be that word kind of makes it even into another language. So, I mean, it's just, this is why we need translations all the time, because languages change and culture change. Also, our ability to pay attention changes. I find myself that I'm a less careful a reader. That's why I kind of need to have these processes by which I kind of return back to the text, and thinking through the process consciously makes me a better reader and better translator. And also just having, doing it as part of a community, because we really became distracted as a culture. It doesn't benefit our way of thinking. We became, as a culture, much more. The distractibility has a kind of consequence in the quality of our thinking. So we have to find ways to slow everything down. Just as with slow cooking, I'm a fan of slow translation.
Slow translation. What a great phrase.
I just came up with it on the spot. So, but, and again, my translation is indeed slow, especially when it comes to rhyme poetry, and especially when it comes to Ginchanka. It's embarrassingly slow, but I'm almost done. I am just about, because I'm also including the translations of Ginchanka as part of her collected works. I'm also translating not the translations, but also offering my translations of the original works that she translated herself into Polish. It's a bilingual issue. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's a bilingual edition, I should say.
Oh, beautiful. Which leads me on to ask you about the role of the translator. What is your role as someone who takes a text in one language and then translates it into another language? It's not just a mechanical thing, is it? We've been talking a lot, so much during this interview about diving into a culture, diving into a language, trying to work out what the author is trying to say. How does the translator deal with all of this?
Well, it comes in everything in life comes to desire. And I think that, essential to all of this is a desire to communicate the work of another. So my role as a translator is to recognize both the tremendous potential, and again, which is actualized through collaborative effort, where, of course, the translator is the arbiter of the ultimate sort of version. And again, I don't believe that there is, for me, that the translation process is ever over. There can be a published translation that then I revise. So I've envisioned myself as kind of as a constant sort of reviser, but someone who is moved by this desire to serve and enrich myself and enrich others with the work of another. And it's very important to also awaken the desire for that work in the new audience. So that's why paratext helps. That's why it is essential that you provide notes, that you have multiple strategies to reach audiences. So, the translator is also in some ways involved in promoting the work of that author. And ultimately, it is, a way to engage, in my case, oftentimes, these are poets that are no longer with us. When it came to Szymborska and Różewicz, they were alive when I translated and published most of their work, but I'm continuing to bring their works out. And it's amazing. Szymborska talks about the revenge of the mortal hand. There is something unbelievable about the ability to connect to the thoughts, and in the case of Ginchanka, to watch the process of awakening of oneself to consciousness, to the ability to create, the process of thinking through the world in poetry, realizing the potential of poetry and actualizing it, and to kind of, again, despite against all odds, because some poetry survives in most unexpected ways. And in her case, it was through a lot of her oeuvre was preserved by Eric Lipinski, who had the presence of mind in 1939 to go into her apartment, raid her drawers, and pack her stuff and preserve it through the war. And for us to have that, and it's an amazing thing that we have that available in the Museum of Adam Mickiewicz Museum of Literature in Warsaw, her 2 notebooks that he rescued from the war and from non-existence. So in a way, I mean, translator also is involved in recovering at times texts from oblivion, from non-existence at times, the way kind of I did through visiting archives in Lviv and found some translations that I did not know existed. So that's again a communal effort, because when I went to Lviv, it turned out that the library, Vasil Stefanuk Library, was closed for the summer. So I had the incredible luck of meeting people who made things possible. And I want to kind of always acknowledge the fact that the translator is not working alone.
Indeed. My last question, and I kind of had to ask this because this is the Holistic Podcast, and you are now translating something by Michał Dziuda, am I right?
That's right, yes.
Can you say a little bit about what it's like to translate Michał Dziuda? Obviously, reading him in Polish is one thing, translating him is another.
Sure. So basically, first of all, I don't take on projects that are kind of not my own, and I was not familiar with his work at all. But so I was about to kind of say no, but I missed a couple of emails. They landed in my spam, and I felt really bad about it. So at least I wanted to say no after I took a look at the poems that I was supposed to be translating.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually was very taken by them. So they kind of awaken a desire in me to communicate them to others. And but I was very busy at the time, and I just wanted to finish some projects first. So I kind of started to look for who this person was, and I didn't find anything. And I
Right.
But I was intrigued enough to say maybe, given the right terms, and especially given a certain sort of ability to control the time, because as I said, I'm a slow translator. So I wanted to have that luxury of time, and I was provided that, and I started to translate it. I already translated a whole, but again, these are provisional translations, so that the kind of moment of reading and producing an initial translation of one of the volumes is done. It's been a very fun project, and I already tested it on a new audience. I read it to a group of students, faculty at Translation Day in December, and I was the first one to read, and it met with an ovation. I was really surprised. So I think that with more revision, with more thinking, with more engagement, there will be translations that can be tested again on new audiences, and that's what I'm hoping to do in this new year. So
sounds great. That's absolutely fantastic. Well, you have a volunteer right here if you need one for your translations, Professor Professor Joanna.
All the volunteers I get.
Joanna Trzeciak Huss from Kent State University, many thanks for coming on this edition of the Holistic Podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
For more podcasts from Holistic, check the show notes to this episode and also be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Thanks for listening.